Usually, when you want to break into sports journalism, there's a clear path. You go to journalism school, you take an unpaid internship, you fetch coffee. But Steve Goldberg, he essentially accidentally hired himself. Back in the 70s, Steve was playing amateur soccer in Charlotte, North Carolina, for a team named after a Greek restaurant.
So we'd have these games, and we had one of the famous amateur teams in Charlotte was called Press Box. That was a team that Eddie had put together. Press Box was a restaurant over on Montford Drive in Charlotte, owned by Greeks. And I wanted to get, some recognition for what we were doing. So I would call the Observer and give them our scores, and they would put in a couple of paragraphs about it. And I never asked for money. It wasn't about that. It was just about getting our names in the papers sometimes.
Yeah.
And they're saying it's like if someone scored, 2 goals or a hat trick or something, they usually get their name mentioned and stuff. But somehow they sent me a check for like $10. And I thought, oh, okay. So that planted the seed that you can actually get paid for writing stuff.
It's time for the Charlotte FC podcast. From Side Story Sports, this is the Charlotte FC podcast, and I'm Nick Finelli. Today's theme, polite audacity. We're looking at how a kid who just wanted to play soccer wound up crossing paths with absolute legends. We're talking Maradona, Franz Beckenbauer, Johan Cruyff, Pele, and even baseball royalty like Hank Aaron. He even worked alongside Don Garber before he was ever known as the Soccer Don. And he did it all, usually just by having the nerve to ask. First half, the hustle. Before Steve was crossing paths with international soccer royalty, he was on the ground floor of professional soccer right here in Charlotte. Long before Charlotte FC, there was the Carolina Lightnin. And Steve was quietly in the background, helping set the stage.
I was somewhat directly involved in, the things that led to the Carolina Lightnin, which then led to other things. And so that was during my time working for the Chiefs. And, serendipity, just the happen chance of events. Well, I started playing soccer at 14, which is ancient by current standards, but in 1971 in Charlotte, that was the first you could get in there. Charlotte Junior Soccer had maybe 40 kids that wanted to play in addition to high school. And so I haven't stopped since.
Years after that $10 check, Steve finds himself in Munich, Germany. He ends up near the training ground for Bayern Munich, one of the biggest soccer clubs in the world. And Steve hears that a kid he plays pickup with got invited to a tryout for their amateur reserve team.
When the Cosmos came to Atlanta, I had just the summer before in 1978, I had gone over to the Germany with the University of North Carolina soccer team. Anson Dorrance was the coach then. He wasn't that far removed from being a player where he played in the late 70s. And because I was considering transferring to Chapel Hill at that point. And so I went over with them for a summer tour around Munich. And I stayed because our quarter system and the semester systems didn't match up. I had stayed out of school and worked, and then I went over and I stayed with some family friends from Charlotte. The father there he ran the post exchange at the U.S. Air Force Base in Munich. And it happened to be in Fassangarten, south of Munich. It was very close to Zebenerstrasse, which is the Bayern Munich training grounds. And as you know about European clubs, it's not just a team. They're usually giant membership clubs. They have multiple sports. They might have a professional soccer club like Real Madrid or Barcelona, Bayern Munich or Hamburg or something like that. They also have all these other sports. They have gymnastics, they have swimming, they have track and other things. They're famous for their professional teams, but all of them, Bayern Munich also has professional basketball teams, in the German Basketball Federation.
German leagues, yeah.
Yeah. So with some of the other players, so in North Carolina, we played 6-8 games in the Munich area. And then I just stayed, to travel around Europe for the rest of the summer. And I was playing, just pickup games with some of the guys, some Americans, some internationals who live in the Fasan area. And there was a Nigerian kid who received an invitation to try out for Bayern's amateur team. And so we used to go over and stand outside. It was a gated facility. We used to just go stand outside there and look in. All the main players were already in Argentina for the World Cup. There wasn't much going on there during the summer. But when he got this invitation, I said, oh, I'm going with you. He says, you can't go. You're not invited. I said, I don't care. I will do anything to get inside that gate. And so when he went to report for, the first tryouts, I went with him, and I had limited German. I took 4 years of high school French, and all I learned to say was "Je ne give a damn pas." I took 3 months of German in college, and I had a good foundation. I got there, and basically I was able to convince them to let me come in and try out as well in exchange for coaching their kids in basketball. I was a perfectly mediocre basketball player who had a little more insight than, let's say, some of the Germans did. I went to Dean Smith basketball camp as a kid, so I knew my fundamentals. And somehow they let me do this. I would coach kids in basketball, and I tried out with their amateur reserve team.
Still,
But for the first 3 days, we just went. Bayern's not technically the Black Forest, but it's much like it. They took us out and we just ran, and running was my superpower. I was like Bronico without the technical ability. I had a very good motor. I wasn't fast, but I could run at the same pace for, two 90 minutes in a row. I had endurance. And so when we were running, I was as good as anybody out there. And then when we started training on the pitches and the ball came in and my technical abilities, let's say I wasn't as good as anybody out there, but I've taken my mediocrity to high levels. I make the good players work a lot harder, especially when I'm playing against them. So I've been fortunate to I can play on a lot of different levels, but I'm a role player. I'm not going to change the level.
But you play to your strengths, and that could be, detrimental to someone else's because of that super skill that you might have.
Yeah, I mean, my belief is that there's only two positions in soccer, really. There's on the field and on the bench. And as long as you're on the field, that's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter if you're left, right, front, back, middle, and stuff. As long as you're playing, life is good.
Yeah. So you ended up on the bus? Like, what's the deal?
So fast forward, when the Cosmos come to Atlanta in '79, I made it a point to go to the Cosmos locker room afterwards and introduce myself to Franz Beckenbauer, speaking, my feeble German about, I've been to Zebenstrasse, and it's like, because I was dropping these things that he was familiar with, again, beautiful man, very gracious with his time. And I have a photograph that I didn't even know was taken at the time by the Chiefs photographer who was in the locker room. And a picture of me talking to Franz. And so that was when we first met. And then after I had graduated from Georgia, I went up and ended up living in New York. I went to visit a friend for 2 weeks, accidentally got a job and stayed for 15 years. But from the early 80s, I was covering the Cosmos in the press box at Giant Stadium. And through that, I had more opportunities to talk to Franz, and he remembered me from Atlanta, or at least pretended he did, but I believe he actually did. And sometimes I would see him in Midtown New York, because he loved, like many athletes who are superstars overseas, and they come here, Alessandro Del Piero and others like that, who could not go outside in Italy, can walk around Los Angeles and in anonymity.
Nobody would recognize him. Yeah.
But every now and then I would see Franz, around the library in New York, because he was around Midtown in that area. And we knew each other, was respectful and things, and would share some stories. And then, so.
That same polite audacity helped him meet his personal holy trinity of soccer legends, Johan Cruyff, Pelé, and Franz Beckenbauer. Like sneaking Johan Cruyff up the back stairs of a pub after a match.
I also got to meet Johan Cruyff when he came in with Aztecs. And I made it a point to, at Fulton County Stadium, they had a bar up on the third floor. And it would be open after the games, after the Chiefs games. I went to the Aztecs locker room, and because I always wanted to meet Cruyff. He's part of Beckenbauer and Pelé are my holy trinity of soccer players. I said, listen, we have all the Aztecs, they're not leaving. The pub is open. I can bring you up the back way so we can get in without you being caught at the front door. So we go in the back of the restaurant up there, and I said, I'll get you a beer. So I bring him over a beer, and we're sitting there. I got to talk to him for like 30 minutes before he got recognized, and then it was just autograph city after that. It was a rare and special moment.
But the ultimate test of Steve's hustle happened at the 1986 World Cup. Franz Beckenbauer is swarmed by the global press, making a beeline for the team bus.
He was a coach for West Germany and Mexico in '86, and can't remember like who they had just played, but the post-game press conference didn't go well. It kind of got cut short. And back then there was no mix zones. We actually we could get around to where the team buses were. So myself and some British and Canadian and other journalists who were there, we're still trying to get some quotes and things. So we're going around and stuff. And I had not seen him yet at his World Cup. I'd been in there in press conferences. So we get around there, and the players are getting on the bus, and then Franz comes in, and like he's getting on the bus, and no one's talking to anyone. The players are just getting on. And I just like, Franz, verzeihen mir, do you remember me off the Cosmos? And he looks at me, and he sees me, and he waves me onto the bus. And I have my Panasonic cassette recorder because no one had the micro cassettes back then. Actually, a lot of writers didn't even use recorders. I was terrible. I did it to make sure I got my quotes right and stuff like we still do. And now we have Otter to transcribe them. We still have to fix that. But so he called me onto the bus. And so I'm looking back at, this is my first World Cup.
Bye guys, I'm going on the bus.
Brian Glanville from the Sunday Times and these legendary soccer writers are there. And they're looking at me like, who the hell is this guy?
Right.
I shared my stuff, but so I was able to go on. Franz, I answered questions, and we all pretty much had the same questions. I got it, and I shared the audio with the other guys because they would have it would have been impertinent and probably not helpful to me for the rest of the World Cup if I hadn't. But it was a chance because of my prior relationship, just knowing them from the Cosmos and that first meeting there and the small Bayern connection. It's like those are the little things that happen, accidents of fate.
Steve has finessed his way into rooms with the biggest legends in the game. But as I kept talking to him, I realized he has just as much passion for the unsung heroes of the Paralympics as he does for the World Cup icons. For the rest of the episode, we're going to step out of the narrator booth and bring you the rest of my conversation with Steve Goldberg, raw and uncut. Second half, the human element.
I've known you now for 4 years, and, I just love hearing the stories because you've had such a rich history and so many different, viewpoints, and your writing style and the reason that you do focus on stories and not just like, here's the event, but here's the stuff that really happened, that mattered, and not just the scoreline and stuff like that. And that's what I love about you. And that's why I wanted to talk to you. So first of all, Steve Goldberg, welcome to the Charlotte FC podcast. I want to start out with that most important line in your bio. It says that you currently play for Old Mech FC, which you call the Jurassic Division. So paint the picture for me. What is that?
Old Mech is one of the oldest, standing teams in the Charlotte area, and we play in the Charlotte Premier Soccer League, amateur and stuff. But we've got a lot of guys who have played some, at good, high, non-professional level ball. And so I started there with the open division. Then they started in over 30, then in over 40, then over 50. And then they wanted to call it, the league calls it the silver division. And to me, that sounds like just a bad infomercial for an insurance product or something. So I'm owning it. I'm going with Jurassic.
Nice. So what is it like? It's every Sunday you play? What is the feeling like when you're lacing up? Because you watch all these games and then you get to actually do it. Like, what does that feel like just to do that each week?
Well, it's my normal. I haven't stopped doing it since I was 14. Soccer is my normal. It's a game that I fell in love with early. I was in the first graduating class at Providence Day, and we were a very small school then. Didn't have an American football team. Soccer was the main fall sport that kind of brought everybody, the teachers and the parents and the students all together. And it was a game that was just really, soccer's been in the United States longer than it's been in Brazil.
Yeah.
stuff with the English and the Scotch Irish, the Germans, the Italians, all the people that make up the tapestry of this country brought it over. And so, I mean, the cultural soccer base in Charlotte when I first started playing was Greek. I learned to cuss in Greek before I learned to cuss in Spanish and such.
And
And
now you're fluent in 40 languages, right?
I can I can say things in a lot of different languages, but I can also order beer and ask politely where the bathroom is.
Nice. So when you're playing out there, like, are you as critical on yourself, or is by now you're kind of like, this is what it is? Because
Oh
I mean, you
no.
see the greatness on the pitch all the time, and you're like, all right, can I get a little curve around for this one, or I hit that wrong and it skied 10 feet over the goal.
Well, no, I'm hyper competitive with the other team, but also with myself. If we lose, if I make a mistake that leads to a goal, which fortunately doesn't happen too often, but that will bother me until the next game when I have a chance to correct it. The unfortunate thing is we don't get to train. Our first training session is usually our first game. So we're,
Yeah.
feeling out the pieces, but we've played together for a long time. And, that's part of what works. And we have a good mix, bunch of great
So,
guys.
so what is your position? What do you focus in on when you're out there?
Well, in college, I was a center mid and stuff. As I got older, I've moved further back. When I was in New York and I was playing with New York Athletic Club, I was a center back. Now I play on the outside, either left or right. Um,
Mhm.
I'm good with that. And I'm a defense first kind of guy. I'm more about the clean sheet than, I figure if they don't score, I'll leave it to our guys up front to, get the
Something's bound to
points.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And then as far as, that angle of playing, you also got into writing, and you even said that like your first, I guess, writing career started when you got a $10 check to write an article for the Observer. Is that right?
Well, it
Or
wasn't
or
an
was it high school scores or something like that, right?
no, it was there's a guy you may have seen him interviewed when the Charlotte FC introduced the third kit last year, celebrating the Carolina Lightnin. Ed
Hmm.
Young.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
Ed was a goalkeeper at Western Carolina, and Ed has always been the person who organizes soccer in Charlotte on so many different levels. And when he was in college, he started a league, over the summer for the college players. I was still in high school at the time, for the college players to stay fit over the summer.
Hmm.
And it was through that you know, it just, where I learned to play, because I didn't have a, a real coach in high school and stuff. So technically, I was never great from that point of view. I don't dribble. I know where the ball is going before the ball does. I
Hmm.
I know where it's going before I get it. If I hold the ball more than 3, 4 touches, it's too long and stuff. I learned to read the game because my high school coach said he used to time me with a calendar. Speed is I never had the pace to get out of trouble with things like that. So I've always been kind of a student of the game. I had to understand it in order to be successful in it.
Yeah. Do you see that in a lot of players, like right away? Is that like your first instinct? You can tell, like, hey, they were really the student first and their athleticism may have come later.
Oh, absolutely. There are some people who can get by totally on athleticism, but there are a lot of players who have good soccer skills. They can dribble, they can shoot, but they don't run to the right areas. They don't anticipate where, they keep asking for the ball at their feet when running into space is the better thing to do because they actually have some pace and
Mhm.
it frustrates me. I'm trying to set them up for the best success. And sometimes they don't make it as easy as it should be.
So where did all the writing come in? You began as a writer, how then?
It was always a skill set that came more naturally to me. With that, and I said, well, it's actually funny now because I remember in elementary school where it said we need you to write 100-word essay. And I went, 100 words? I can't write 100 words. It's like I can write a sentence that's 100 words now. I have discovered and become one with the Oxford comma. Um, but yeah, it's a lot harder for me to write short than to write long because
Yeah.
I will do 1,500 words that feel like 500 stuff because it's tight, it has pace. And, again, just trying to paint a picture.
Hmm.
I've been influenced by some wonderful writers over the years. I believe everything is a people's story in
Yeah.
some way. Sometimes things are just need to be factual and things like that. But if you can give it the human element, something that builds a connection with the reader, that's what works.
Yeah, I think that's also what makes what you watch on the event, even if you're just watching a game, if you know more about that person, their struggle before, or something that's been waiting on them, and you see that, and you see how they play or they slide or something, or maybe they're battling from an injury that we didn't know about. Like all those things take into account, and you just appreciate it more when they're out there.
Yeah.
All right. So I know you've been to some pretty big events, but probably one of the biggest ones, and I think probably a good story, is from the Maradona Argentina England match. I believe that was
Yeah.
in Mexico City. You were there, right?
Yes, that was my first World Cup in person. And I was covering for USA Today. And there were not the US was not in the World Cup then. But I knew the people there. I'd done some work with the Olympics in '84, and I'd been working with a PR firm in New York. I'd been writing for Soccer America since 1980, doing feature stories and things like that. But the game that defined that World Cup was Argentina and England, and
This
it
was
was
after the Falkland War, right? So it was a couple years after that.
oh no, well the Falkland War was like late '70s, so like
Or okay,
just around the
yeah,
time of the '78 World Cup, which was in Argentina.
got it.
Um, and that one I know well because I became a Spurs fan because of Osvaldo Ardias and Ricky Villa, two of the players on that '78 Argentina team that later went to play for Tottenham Hotspur.
Hmm.
And when I got to see them play, and you had to go to a bar to watch a game on closed circuit TV back then, there was soccer on TV was almost non-existent. People don't now I can have it on 30 different channels.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to watch soccer, you really had to fight for it and earn it back then. So yeah, but the Falklands, the Malvinas, as they say in Argentina, has never not been a sore spot between the two countries when it comes on the political side. But that game, just the way it was shaping up, and that was um, Argentina was an average team that super overachieved with above average player in
Hmm.
Diego Maradona. He had been at Barcelona until like 1984. I actually ended up sitting next to him after a Transatlantic Cup tournament at Giant Stadium when he was with Barcelona. It was the summer between him leaving Barcelona to go to Napoli. And then at
Hmm.
Napoli is when he became, the true legend that he is. But
Yeah.
what he did for Napoli is the same thing that he did for Argentina. He took all these players, Burachaga, Brown, and others, and he lifted them all up. And Argentina was just a phenomenal team. And Maradona was just magic. And so
Hmm.
I was blessed to see him play the stuff he did, his fight. And this was back when players, they're far more protected now than they were at that time, and especially prior to that time.
Right.
He suffered, tremendous abuse, as did Pele, as did Eusebio, Cruyff, and all the others that had been stars. Just going back to Stefano, football was a very physical match
Hmm.
around the world. Back then, yeah, you either one or the other. So I was up in the press tribune in Azteca Stadium, but I was writing for USA Today, so I didn't have to take a lot of notes because my story wasn't going to be that long. So I was taking thousands of photographs. I was
Hmm.
fortunate that Kodak and Fuji would give us film and process it for free. It wasn't digital back then, and
So you just
so I
took
was, I,
rolls and rolls.
oh yeah, and a roll is 36 shots, and so you
Because you
know
have no idea what you took.
No, you don't get it. And so I'm up there and I'm shooting the game with a 300 millimeter lens from the press tribune and making a few notes here and there. So I have photographs, the hand of God goal up against Peter Shilton. Um, and so that's maybe the most infamous goal in soccer history. And I do not blame Maradona for that. Totally, it's on the referees. The two ARs and everybody in the stadium, everybody watching on TV saw it, but the referee. Three
Hmm.
people in the entire world did not see the handball. And unfortunately, they were the ones officiating the game.
They didn't
However,
want to see it.
he scored a second goal where he dribbled from just the other side of midfield. That is is arguably the most beautiful goal I've ever seen. Where I've seen goals at George Best where just the slightest touch from a defender would have put it off, and he scored that. It was magnificent. So yeah, I was in Azteca Stadium for that game.
So an atmosphere like that in the press box, is it totally different than, kind of your normal run of the mill, just a regular game? Like, are people is it just loud and boisterous, or people cheering?
Absolutely. No cheering in the press box is an American thing. And
that's what I thought.
From what Red Smith, who the great and legendary writer for the New York Times, once told the story, is that it was essentially because of baseball. And what happened, back in the day when, the beat writers from town would travel with the Yankees and the Dodgers and the Indians, they were almost part of the team. That's why a lot of the stuff that you see in TMZ and all this, the news now about the dark side of sports and things, they didn't write about that stuff because they were in there. But so the writers, they would get into fights and saying, if you look at The Natural with Robert Redford.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up, that's what it made me think of. Like that's how it was, right? They didn't tell about all the bad side of the athletes.
But they didn't tell about it, but they would also defend their team sometimes with fisticuffs if necessary, if they thought they were so abridged, with that. So that's why the whole concept of no cheering in the press box was essentially instituted in American sports, was to keep sports writers from putting too much action in the press box than on the pitch or on the field at that time. But no, if you're in an international game, it's quite emotional. It's a lot going on.
Knowing this coach, knowing this player, knowing this referee or this announcer.
Well, it used to be a very small world, and we all felt like we knew each other at that point because there weren't that many of us into soccer back then. But so we're at this game. It was Brazil, Argentina, and Brazil hit the post like 3 times, but they couldn't score the ball. Maradona did 2 things in the game. Once he changed his shoes on the side of the pitch while the game was going on. So Puma got great publicity from all the cameras focusing on Maradona sitting on the sideline, putting on another pair of boots. And then he played the ball through to Canizia for a goal that Argentina, who was not as a beautiful team in 1990 as they were in 96, they were very negative as defending champions. Argentina upset a much better Brazil team. And there was a Brazilian broadcaster who was behind us in the press tribune, and he was like just talking after the game had ended. He kept going for a good 45 minutes in Portuguese, just things, and the only words I could kind of translate, Antichrist was one of them and stuff, but he was just passionately just replaying the whole game to his audience with that. And we're packing up, we're leaving, and this guy is still there talking into the microphone, and he's not leaving because the worst thing in the world just happened.
Yeah.
There is tremendous.
Yeah. So with that, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Steve Goldberg. All right, Steve. So I wanted to pick up because you brought in, I talked about the Kevin Bacon thing as a joke, but in the seriousness, you seem to be like the Forrest Gump of soccer. You put yourself in these situations, we wouldn't expect it. So like the story of you on the West German team bus. Tell me about that. And I know you have some sort of like relationship with Franz Beckenbauer because you worked at the Atlanta Chiefs, right? And somehow he was connected there, right?
Yeah, and during my senior year at Georgia, the Atlanta Chiefs, that previously had been the Colorado Caribou, had moved from Denver to Atlanta. And Atlanta had won the first NASL title in 1968. And why they were so far ahead of Charlotte and other southern cities in soccer was because so many of those players from those South American teams, Phil Woosnam was a player coach with that team. He later became the commissioner of the North American Soccer League. And he was one of the British players that came over. And all of those guys from the late 60s and then into the early 70s stayed in Atlanta. They became coaches. They coached at a high level. So many of the guys that I played with at the University of Georgia and Georgia State had learned from these guys and come through, and they were much more advanced soccer players than I was at that time because they had superior professional experienced coaches at that time. So I'm working for the Chiefs. I mean, our whole front office was maybe 20 people. The content team at Charlotte FC has more people on it.
Right.
It's professional teams. But then again, in the ABA, the Carolina Cougars, their front office was maybe 15 people back in the late 60s, early 70s. And you look at how big the Hornets are now. So I'm working with the Chiefs. I'm not an intern. I'm a paid employee, which had its advantages. I got to hang out with these professional players and stuff. They didn't have a big roster. So myself and some of the guys on the sales side who were former college players and stuff, we were sometimes practice players, which was really fun. But practice then, we didn't have a training site. We practiced on the intramural fields at Emory University or some other places because it was not a sophisticated operation at that point. All of our backroom stuff was run through the Atlanta Braves. Ted Turner was the owner of the team. The late Dick Cecil.
He owned the whole city then. So
Captain Outrageous. Yeah, Ted was amazing. But through that, there was a lot of opportunity. That's how I got to meet Hank Aaron because his office was right across from the elevator at the top of Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, and we were down in the tunnels at the bottom. And I was assistant to the marketing director. I was assistant to the PR director. I was assistant to anyone who needed something done. I was still in college. And so I would be the guy who'd take stuff up to the Braves office. And every time the elevator door would open and the bell would ring, if Hank was in his office, he'd look up just as one would do. And so I finally worked up the nerve to say hello to him one day. And it was like, Hank Aaron. I mean, that was awesome.
like, what do you say? Like, how do you introduce that? Do you remember?
I said, I apologize for, the distraction. He says, that's what I get with my office across from the elevator. And he was a beautiful and supremely gracious man. And everything that you think Hank Aaron is, he really is. And that was wonderful. But he speaks to people on a level basis. There's no pretense about him and stuff. And I was in the process of learning that myself, is that if you want to talk level to people like we're doing now, you talk to a person like a person. You don't talk up to them and force them to talk down to you. You don't talk down to people. You treat everyone with respect, and and hopefully that will come back to you. When I was covering the 2012 Paralympic Games in London, Cruyff's Foundation was a big benefactor of Paralympic sports in the Netherlands. And so I was covering for the U.S. Tennis Association. So I was at the draw for the tennis thing, and I'm looking back over my shoulder, and I said, no, that couldn't be. Cruyff was at the draw. He had come to London. He was at the draw. And I'm just like, at that point, I'm totally distracted. I'm not paying any attention to the draw at all, even though I've got it right about it, because it's Cruyff. And so this was 2012. I hadn't seen him since, again, 79.
That's a long time.
Yeah, but the draw could not get over fast enough. And I'm just praying that I have time to get over to say hello to him, which I did. And it was like, he said he remembered me as well, which I know he didn't. But again, a very gracious man.
It's a good thing to learn to tell people. Just pretend you always remember them.
Yeah.
Because it makes them feel good.
Yeah. And so I was 2 out of 3 for that point. And then when I was working as chief press officer for the Paralympic Games in Atlanta in 96, and the U.S. soccer team was going to play Brazil down at Clark University. This is a cerebral palsy team in the Paralympics, which has now, been part of the U.S. national extended national teams. They also have deaf soccer and things like that. And it's included
Yeah.
in a group that also includes futsal and beach soccer is under the ENTs now. So
Yeah.
I was pretty much wedded to the Olympic Stadium and the Paralympic Stadium because I was in charge of everything. But this was one event that I was getting out to. And
Mhm.
because I knew Pele was going to be there, he was the Minister of Sport for Brazil at the time. And so he was there. I
Oh,
was
pretty
working for the
nice.
Atlanta Paralympic Organizing Committee. That's the job that got me from New York back to the South in 95 and through the games conclusions, in 96. And so again, I had already met two of my Holy Trinity and Beckenbauer and Cruyff. And while I was in New York, I had become friendly with Professor Julio Mazzei, who was kind of the mentor to Pelé and one-time coach of the Cosmos for a while, and just a wonderful man. And we always talked about he was going to introduce me to Pelé, but it like never happened. Sometimes might been in the same thing at a big function, but it was never the right opportunity. So I was not going to let this pass. And I went there and I waited till after the match, and Pelé is coming out of the box that they had him, and he's got security and around him and all that. And I come out in the hallway and I have my credential that shows I belong there and stuff. But I say,
Mhm.
Pelé, I'm a friend of Professor Mazzei. And he just looks at me and he says, a friend of the professor is a friend of mine. And he comes up and he gives me this giant hug. And it was just, oh, I was good. I checked all my
Yeah.
boxes. I could have died right then and
Wow.
been happy. So
That's
I've been
amazing.
very fortunate to meet, you know, a lot of my soccer heroes.
And talk to them too, and not just be like, oh, I'm a fan. Like you got to talk to them, which is pretty cool. And I think a lot of people, you take that for granted, especially in today's world where everybody's just trying to get the picture or the thing with it. But you could have not had any picture or anything like that. It's up here and it's the whole conversation. I think that's pretty special.
I forget to take a picture, and this is before cell phone cameras and stuff like that. But it's like
Right.
I didn't even think about that, which is unfortunate because even the photo with Beckenbauer, I didn't even know it was taken until like even a year later when the guy said, "Oh, by the way, I'd taken this photo of you, with Beckenbauer." I was like, "Wait, what?" and stuff. So I have it, and later I actually got Franz to sign it, which was great. Um, uh, but yeah, in those moments, it's just taking the opportunity to meet history. When I was living in New York, evidently Charles Kuralt lived around the block from me. And, he's from North Carolina. His father worked here in Charlotte. And I loved watching him on CBS, morning news and his on the road
Mhm.
broadcast. And he was buying a Christmas tree at the deli across the street from my apartment in New York. And it's like, I did not hesitate to take the chance to say hello to Charles Kuralt,
Right.
with this thing. But it's always about you're meeting a person and treat them with respect, and hopefully that will come back to you. And it will with most people.
Yeah.
Celebrities, they want to treat people on an equal basis. And you know that talking to all the athletes that you have and others,
Hmm.
if you want respect, give respect.
Right.
And you can still appreciate, you can still be a fan, but don't force people to talk down to you and stuff. Just be regular.
Right. Right. And you just talked about your kind of shift down to Atlanta from New York with the Paralympics. Now, when you go and watch and cover an event like that, was there any like special thing in your life that made you draw towards that, or was it just an opportunity? And then when you see it, you're like, wait a second, this is really kind of what sports are about, especially
Well,
for people that aren't there for the big, the big sport event and games. It's kind of the game after the games.
yeah, well, my career in New York, I worked for a couple of magazines, and between the magazines, I worked for Reuter and Finn, a public relations agency, and my main account was the Miller Brewing. And coincidentally, a colleague of mine at Reuter is now commissioner of Major League Soccer, Don Garber. Don ran the Kinney Foot Locker account. So we worked together through that period. We used to kick a soccer ball around the halls late at night because, don't tell our clients this, but most junior people do most of the work, but we don't get most of the compensation for it. So we'd be at the office till 10 o'clock at night, and my boss for some reason, he had a soccer ball in his office, and we'd kick it around the hallways some, which that was Don's soccer experience prior to that. But he also worked for NFL Properties, which is basically the Wharton School of Sports Management.
Right, right.
NFL Properties is a thing there, but So working through that, I had a lot of experience working with celebrities, the Miller Lite All-Stars, which is where I first met Rodney Marsh, who would later become the coach of the Carolina Lightning,
Hmm.
uh, and such there. He was one of the Miller Lite All-Stars and things like that. And such, and where were we going again? It's like I get off on tangents.
No, it's okay. It's okay. So what I was saying was that I just felt like watching and
Oh,
being part of the
oh, the
Paralympics,
Paralympics.
you
Yeah,
started having like a different view of what sport really is,
yeah,
versus this big
right.
atmosphere thing that we are a
Well,
part of too.
so while I was at Reuter, I had worked on a project with one of our clients, Glaxo Pharmaceutical, on the first ventilators, the medications for athletes with asthma that were approved by the IOC.
Hmm.
And so I worked on that, getting publicity around the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984, working with Jim Ryan, the former 1500-meter runner, who later a congressman from Kansas and such. And from that experience, I then went to cover the 88 Olympics in Seoul. I had started writing freelance for UPI,
Hmm.
which used to be a competitor to the Associated Press. And uh, after the Olympic Games in Seoul, where I covered volleyball and cycling, got to talk to Karch Karai and Steve Timmons and Bob Stavarlik and all the great Olympic volleyball players.
Hmm.
Um, an editor, we stayed just to travel around Korea. When we came back, we noticed that the venues were still lit up and things like that. And we said, well, what's going on? He said, it's the Paralympic Games. I said, what is that? What's the Paralympic Games? It's for people with a disability. I said, well, why didn't you tell us about this? And they said, well, we didn't think you'd want to know. And so we
Yeah.
immediately replied, like, well, we're journalists. We want to know everything. We may not write about everything, but we want to know
Right.
so we can make a decision. And so I was still hanging in Korea with the editor. He flew back to New York. I got to see wheelchair basketball the first time in the same venue where the Olympic basketball was. I got to see wheelchair racing in the Olympic Stadium, and it was nice. It was inspiring. I wrote a couple of things for UPI and sent it back to them on that. And after that, I really didn't think about it all that much. Uh, and and how worlds come together. The general manager of the Atlanta Chiefs when I worked for them was a guy named Terry Hansen. He had actually worked for the Dips previously
Hmm.
and such. He was also the color man on our broadcast with Bob Neal, who was a famous broadcaster for Turner.
Hmm.
Um, Terry became like a deal maker in television. He actually moved to Charlotte to work with the Raycom and their properties for a bit. And he was a mentor to me. I learned so much from him, just phenomenal person. And he called me in New York and said that, and I'd been in New York for 15 years at that time, and probably 5 years too many, because I liked it, but I didn't love it. Even though I'm a half breed, my parents are from Queens. I'm born and raised in Charlotte. I believe barbecue is kosher. Um, and so Terry had called me in New York and he said, the Paralympic Games in Atlanta need a new chief press officer. Are you interested? And I'd been trying really to get out of New York and get back south for a while. I said, I'll be there yesterday. And I flew down to Atlanta, I interviewed, got hired, and that's what got me back south, primarily to Charlotte, but I was actually more living in Atlanta. I had a sister
Hmm.
living there. I had a room at her house. And working with the Paralympics, I love the Olympics. I've been watching a
Yeah.
lot from Milan Cortina.
Yeah.
Um, but actually, soccer is what prepared me for working the Paralympic Games because I had been promoting soccer ever since I was in high school, trying first to get it in the Observer, then promoting it, writing for Soccer America, writing for New York Newsday and the New York Post, and wherever I could get stories and stuff in. I did a story on an over 35 team that went to play a tournament in Honolulu, which was great
Right.
because it got me to Honolulu. Um,
Right.
a
And
team
now
from
you write for Charlotte Post too, right?
Yeah, well, that's who I mainly cover for now, but that one was for the
Yeah.
St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Okay.
And so promoting soccer has always been guerrilla tactics. Yeah, I don't take no for an answer. I keep pushing and stuff. I find the human story, the elements in there to make it accessible to everyone. That's what I learned from George Vesey, is that he did, you didn't have to be a soccer fan to appreciate anything that he wrote. You didn't have to be a Loretta Lynn fan to appreciate Coal Miner's Daughter. It was a
Hmm.
great story. And, if I could be 1/10, 1/100th the writer that Bessie was, you know, that would have been, that was my objective. And so, but what I learned, and I used those guerrilla tactics from promoting soccer, I had to do the same thing with Paralympic sport because we had zero awareness in the United States at that time.
Yeah.
And because with Los Angeles, they were coming off the Montreal games and they were just trying to prove that the Olympics were financially viable, after
Right.
the great losses Montreal had. So they did not organize the Paralympics. The Paralympics are always for the most part, it's always in the same country
Yeah.
as the Olympics, but was, you maybe in a lot of times in the same city, but organized separately. And so what I learned is I love the Olympics. The Olympics don't need me. The Paralympics needed
Hmm.
every asset they could get. And now far more people know about it. There's far more awareness. Toyota was a great sponsor in promoting the athletes as equals, leading into the Tokyo games and stuff. And
Hmm.
it's grown. And like
Yeah.
NBC, 1,500 hours, from
Yeah.
Tokyo to Paris.
And
So
then they have all the channels that allows them to also do that
yeah,
too.
but part of my mission also was writing about it. It's like that it's not always about the Tiny Tim story. That isn't it wonderful that these athletes are able to do this? Well,
Right.
yes, it is, but it's also these are world-class athletes. We had Joey Ryman, the great advertiser from Babbitt and Ryman at the time in Atlanta. They ran our campaigns, and he came up with great taglines, just like about an athlete. He has one leg, he uses it to kick ass. Things like that to show the sporting side of it. There was a track and field athlete who had been interviewed for a Sports Illustrated article. He was a discus thrower, and when he was the lead of the story was like when he was approached about being interviewed, he says, "Is this going to be a sports story? I don't do human interest." And it was abrupt, it was rough, and it was perfect because
Hmm.
these, and so getting this, it's still a sports story. The disability is just one part of it because it's not about what you can't do, it's about what you can.
Hmm.
And the Paralympics proved that every time out. So, yeah, that's been a passion and a mission of mine since Atlanta. I've covered every summer Paralympic Games from Sydney through Paris. I was a consultant to the Salt Lake Winter Games, and then I covered in Torino and became a big fan of sled hockey, which is like I call them a bunch of Bobby Orr on their butts.
Oh, wow.
What they do. But yeah, I'm a huge advocate and champion for Paralympic sports.
That is awesome. Steve, this has been awesome. I loved our chat today.
So even though sometimes it may not seem like I'm listening, I always am because, and that's why I started using a recorder before other, trained
Hmm.
journalists did, is because I wanted to be able to listen to the answer instead of trying to write it down and write it down correctly.
Because then it's hard to pay attention too.
Yeah. So I want to listen to the answer so I can actually formulate what my next question might be and things like that. So to be a good writer, you have to be a great listener.
Nice. And did you have a time in your life where you ignored like every logical sign that said you should do this and you're like, screw it, I'm going to do this other thing?
Uh, a daily
Oh.
basis. No, like I said,
And they've all paid off for you, right?
well, they have in certain ways, and I'm probably have missed out on others, but my career has been, fortunate things. The first job I had at a magazine, my boss was a bit of a megalomaniac, but I kind of stuck it out for a bit. And by chance, I got to go work at Reuter and Finn, where I really learned public relations and that aspects of it. I met great people like Don Garber and another friend, Carl Folta, who became, the number two comms guy for Viacom, whereas I called him Sumner Redstone's apologist. Um, uh, with that and other just wonderful people working there. I learned Bill Reuter had been the Undersecretary of Commerce for Kennedy. So, again, those, like
Yeah.
the 6 degrees of separation. I was that kind of link. I knew someone who knew John F. Kennedy.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so I go from there and it's like, I just, being able to cover the Olympics, which led me to the Paralympics and things like that. It's, I've been fortunate. I've done a lot of things, and some of which has, been very important and become missions in my life, and supporting Paralympic sport and supporting,
Mm.
soccer, trying to, do the right thing and, helping to get our country back on track. And, from where we're at now, we're so
Yeah,
polarized, you
yeah,
know, looking to be a unifier.
definitely. Now, do you have a personal ritual or like a weird habit that you feel like has nothing to do with anything of your job or sports, but basically it's how you stay sane?
No, I mean, soccer is always my sanity. My cat is my actually legally registered emotional support animal, because then I don't have to pay pet rent. That is a thing. If you have a pet and they want to charge you rent for it, check out the emotional support animal thing. That's a law in North Carolina. It can save you a lot of money. No, I'm not a superstitious person. Um, I think I'm not a gambler for that thing, because one, I don't win on those things. I don't want to cuss, but no, it's just, I stay active, I'm playing soccer. That's getting out there, having a run with the guys, whether pick up on Wednesday nights or Sunday in my matches.
Hmm.
Uh, that's just, that's what I need. That's La Dolce Vita.
Yeah. Well, that's a good way to end it. Thanks, Steve, for coming on and sharing those great stories and just sharing us a little bit about you and what makes things happen in your world. And I hope people start to read your stuff, because you have a lot of great articles, not
Yeah.
only in the Charlotte Post, but they can find all the other stuff you can do. If there anywhere that you could lead them so they could find more about what you do?
Well, definitely the Charlotte Post, because, Herb White and originally Ashley Mahoney, who's now with Axios, they started the Queen City Football Chronicle over 10 years ago. And it's the longest soccer specific media in Charlotte. They've done a wonderful job with that. Herb has kept it going even after Ashley left. Ashley is a soccer person like we are, and stuff. And I keep wanting to see Axios to even do more on the sport. I had a feature on Claudia Dickey in the Charlotte Observer towards the end of January about whether she may or may not be the next 100-cap keeper for the U.S. women's national team. She played here
Hmm.
at Charlotte Latin and then at University of North Carolina. There's a lot of great local stories here, and read everybody's stuff. I promote everybody's stuff, because if you love the game, it's all good. And thank you for,
Awesome.
doing this, because I see the work that you put in, with this podcast, and just the amount of people that you've talked to. Anybody who wants to work in professional sports, you need to go look at the archives of this podcast, because there's some cheat sheet material in there on, how you can get there from here.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we'll be seeing you in the press box.
Sounds good.
All right. Take care, Steve.
Okay.
Again, thanks for listening to another episode of the Charlotte FC podcast, where we bring you the fascinating people who work for and around Charlotte FC and the world of football. The Charlotte FC podcast is edited and produced by me, Nick Finelli, and Eli Finelli. Please help us out and share this episode with others. 5 stars, and follow CLTFC Podcast on Instagram, X, and YouTube. Until next time, enjoy the day.